Hello, a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's programme, Iraq protests descend into bloodshed, with the military admitting to the use of excessive force. Protesters are demanding a change of government and an end to widespread corruption. Turkey says its military is ready to begin an offensive into northern Syria against Kurdish forces. The US, meanwhile, threatening Ankara with economic sanctions. Also coming up on this week's show, beyond the headlines, in her latest book, Azadeh Moaveni tells the tales of some of the girls who left their families to join the Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. She'll be joining us in the studio to talk about Guest House for Young Widows among the women of ISIS. Thank you for watching Middle East Matters. For over a week now, anger and violence have spread throughout Iraq, leaving over 100 people dead. At the heart of the protest movement, a corrupt leadership, a lack of basic services and unemployment. The Iraqi authorities, for their part, have intermittently cut off the internet, imposed a curfew and deployed security forces to crack down on the protesters. Here's France 24's Luke Schrager with a look back at what brought us here.
It began as yet another protest over living conditions, unemployment and corruption. But this time there was one key difference: the sheer size of the crowd in Baghdad. With authorities caught by surprise, it wasn't long before Iraqi security forces cracked down, using live ammunition.
We want such basic rights: electricity, water, jobs, medicine, nothing else. We don't want power, titles, money or property. We just want to live, a piece of bread to eat. But this government shooting at the crowd and killing people.
In the days after, the protests only intensified, erupting in different areas of the country, as demonstrators insisted on holding their leaders to account.
I have a master's degree, but the government would not even hire me as a street sweeper. All these young people are treated unfairly.
Iraq has seen sporadic protests around the country over the last 13 months, the largest in Basra during a visit by then outgoing Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi in September last year. Nearly 30 people died at the time, with demands the same: more jobs, less graft. Al-Abadi had made promises of grand infrastructure projects, but against a background of entrenched corruption, long present in Iraq since the fall of Saddam Hussein, little changed, particularly against a backdrop of a nation left shattered not just from the previous US invasion and occupation, but several more years of occupation by the Islamic State group, which seized huge swathes of the country before its eventual downfall in 2017. Now, a generation that's known nothing but such chaos has finally come of age and wants better, pushing Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi to make promises of his own.
Parliamentarian reforms could be submitted to Parliament. For instance, countering corruption, financial reforms, job opportunities for the youth, countering poverty, protests laws, infrastructure and administrative reforms.
The problem, the protesters have heard it all before, with Abdul Mahdi coming to power on those same promises. And there's little in the way of recent history to demonstrate they have any reason to believe him now.
The political situation is pretty much structured now throughout communitarian, sectarian interests, and also throughout corruption. It means that for the citizens themselves, they see this political class as massively corrupted and defending their own interest. I'm afraid that the answer that has been brought by the government until now does not correspond at all to the requirements of the demonstrators.
If Iraq's government wants to handle the current crisis, it seems it's going to have to do far more to prove it can, not just taking concrete action, but doing it as soon as possible.
Moving on to an impending conflict in northern Syria, Turkey has threatened to invade the area, casting doubt on the fate of Kurdish forces backed by the US. This comes following a surprise announcement by Donald Trump to pull troops out of the region.
An abandoned military base. Some 50 to 100 U.S. operators were pulled out Monday from northern Syria, amid criticism that the move will allow Turkey to invade the region and push out the Kurds living there. The White House said the troops were simply being redeployed elsewhere. But the American president reiterated his desire to withdraw entirely.
When do we get out? There's got to be a time we get out. We have to bring our people back home.
The Kurdish fighters and citizens say Trump's policy shift is akin to a stab in the back. They led alongside U.S. soldiers the fight against the Islamic State group. But Turkey has long wanted to push out the Kurdish fighters, who they see as terrorists. The Turkish Defense Department said they want to create a so-called safe zone in the territory, and that plans have been finalized for an incursion.
The establishment of a peace corridor is essential. Turkish armed forces will never tolerate terror at our borders. All preparations for the operation have been completed.
Comprised largely of Kurdish fighters, the Syrian Democratic Forces control the area and they guard some 10,000 Islamic State group fighters. They said they're waiting and ready if Turkey attacks.
Threats made by Turkey to attack the area are not something new. They have constantly done this for years. We, as Syrian Democratic Forces, take the matter into account and are fully prepared to fiercely respond to any imminent attack on Syrian soil.
Amid fears that a Turkish invasion would further destabilize the region, the United Nations said they are preparing for the worst.
The Brides of Jihad, married to the Islamic State, women under the Caliphate. Now, these are just a few examples of newspaper headlines about the girls and women hailing from over 50 countries, among them France, who joined the extremist group. Now, one woman decided to dive deeper into their stories. Azadeh Moaveni, an Iranian-American writer, traveled across the Middle East, the Mediterranean to Northern Europe to tell the tales of the, quote, Gone Girls. And she's just published this book on the subject, Guest House for Young Widows. Among the women of ISIS, Azadeh, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, you've been reporting on how women's lives in the region have been affected by war for years. But you embarked on this journey for several reasons. One of them being that you found these girls' stories somewhat familiar, relatable even.
As you said, I've been a Middle East correspondent for so many years. I've covered wars and invasions and all the challenges that women have faced, society to society, having access to politics, any kind of civic empowerment. I was shocked at the way women from Europe started to go, however, the way that the violence of the region has somehow knitted itself to the lives of young people in Europe and the West who seemingly were so disconnected from these politics. So I, as a woman, Middle Eastern, Muslim, growing up in the West, I felt as though I had lived both sides of this experience. And I wanted to be able to tell a story that made it intelligible to others. How could these wars and these conflicts draw in these people who are meant to be of us?
And that's the big question, because you describe some of these women in your book as being respectful, well-read, admired, conservative, but not necessarily devoutly religious. What then drew them to this extreme life choice?
You know, every sort of country that drew women to ISIS, I think, unfolded within the confines of its own challenges. Young women from Europe, often very, very young, were drawn and manipulated and led to think that, you know, they could be joining a utopian society where they wouldn't face street harassment for wearing their headscarves, where they wouldn't have to choose between their European identities and their faith. So, I mean, there are common themes, and I think one of them is a sense of exclusion.
And what's interesting here, there is a paradox, because whilst we know ISIS to be very archaic with its values, and it certainly exploited a lot of these women, you say that it also had the women somewhat at the center of its policies, that it actually empowered some of them.
It sounds really perverse. I understand that. I think the thing that we must really bear in mind with ISIS is the way that in the region unfolded in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And we saw how women were so central to those uprisings, from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Bahrain in Syria. Women were really actively involved. I think this was a generation of young women across the Arab world who had greater expectations, wanted to have a voice in the unfolding political change in their countries. And we saw how that movement descended into greater repression, civil war, country to country. I think ISIS intuited and saw this untapped sort of young female potential. And it was really the first jihadist group that reached out to women specifically. It offered them full-scale membership. It offered them a role in this utopian project. So I think that, in a way, it responded to the frustrations and desires of young women better in some instances than their governments.
Now, if you can tell us about the guest houses for widows, you describe these as places of deliberate torment. If you can give our viewers a small insight into that.
So, guest house, which I borrow for the title of the book, is a place where women upon arrival in the so-called Caliphate were held. And that was where they waited to be matched up with a fighter husband. And when their husbands died fighting, they were taken back expecting to marry and marry again. And they were quite, filthy, difficult places. Women were expected to go back out and raise the next generation to offer comfort to another fighter. So it was a really cruel imposition on women. And because ISIS promising brides to fighters was such a key part of its appeal, it was really for so many women who I think kind of traveled to Syria imagining it to be an empowering and potentially state-building experience. It was the first step into a descent into real horror.
And lastly, and briefly, if you can, I have a slightly more difficult question to end with. Given the time that you spent with these girls and women, do you think that they should be repatriated? This is a massively divisive debate that we're having even here in France. Should they be able to go back to their countries?
I understand the public antipathy and revulsion at the very idea of that, especially in Europe and in countries that suffered attacks, ISIS attacks that were plotted in these areas, who see these women as perpetrators of violence that their societies experienced. I understand that, certainly emotionally, morally. At the same time, these camps are very fragile and dangerous places. There are women amongst them who are genuine victims. But even that aside, there's a real, I think, security risk to keeping them there. There's a very real possibility that a lot of these women could go free, and amongst them there are dangerous women. So while it may be politically deeply unpalatable to any government in Europe to bring, jihadist women back on their watch, ultimately I think in terms of security simply, it is the more strategic and sensible choice.
Of course, especially here in France, we'll be keeping a very close eye on that developing story. Azadeh Moaveni, thank you so much for being with us to share your experience and to talk to us about this book, Guest House for Young Widows, which is available now. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Sana.
And thank you for watching this edition of Middle East Matters. Stay tuned.